You are listening to Kubernetes Bytes, a podcast bringing you the latest from the world of cloud-native data management. My name is Ryan Wallner, and I'm joined by Bhavin Shah, coming to you from Boston, Massachusetts. We'll be sharing our thoughts on recent cloud-native news and talking to industry experts about their experiences and challenges managing the wealth of data in today's cloud-native ecosystem. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, wherever you are. We're coming to you from Boston, Massachusetts. Today is March 20th, 2023. Hope everyone is doing well and staying safe. Let's dive into it. Speaking of March 20th, happy spring. Happy spring. The weather is finally turning around. Last week was nor'easter here, or depending on where you were in Massachusetts, it was rain. 30 inches of snow. Could have been either way, but yeah. What's up, Boston? What's up, Bhavin? I called you Boston. What's up, Boston? What's up with that?
No, Boston has been good. Like as you said, first day of spring, temperatures looking better, and then we had St. Paddy's Day weekend last weekend. So again, I didn't do the traditional parade thing. I think I was just lazy enough to motivate myself to go there, or even convince my friends to join me. So I think we ended up going in the other direction, like finding a brewery in Woburn and then drinking there.
I feel like if you don't go to the parade, you might as well go the opposite direction of everybody else. Not that I've been there either, which I feel like is a bit of a Bostonian sin, a little bit. Maybe we're just not parade people.
Or we are implants. I don't know.
Yeah, St. Paddy's Day is a good time. We mostly hung out with a couple neighbor friends of ours, family friends. Both Friday and Saturday. It was a lot of fun. We just kind of enjoyed some company and staying put. I was in New York past few weekends and things like that, so it's always nice to stay put and hang out a bit. Did a bit of snowboarding on Sunday. Well, I can't say that. I took my daughter for a snowboarding lesson.
Oh, nice.
At Wachusett, which was awesome to see a little 4.5-year-old, just ripping and shredding it up for an hour and a half. She did good. I did not get to go because I was more interested in watching her in her lesson. So
I think you had shared a picture of her snowboarding, maybe the first time she had done it.
And that was with us, running up the mountain with her and bringing her down. But this was like an official lesson. We weren't with her, big step up. She took a lift, aka the magic carpet, for the first time, and was, head over heels about, going up an automated, magic carpet thing, which is highlight of her weekend, I'm sure.
That's so cool, man. 4.5 years, I can't even imagine. I don't think I was doing anything so outdoorsy at 4.5 years old. I was just playing in so we have apartment buildings in Mumbai, right? So it was there was a playground. We were just hanging out there with friends. That's it. That's the extent of my craziness. So
I know. I figured, if I started earlier and just kind of, get her used to it and that kind of thing. I started when I was 12. So, and I really enjoy it. And so I have this vision of just going snowboarding with her. We'll see if it gets there. She's got to like it at the end of the day. I can only introduce it to her. At least that's the way we do things around here. So anyway, it's overall a good weekend. And we have a fun guest that's actually going to be a little bit of a change where we've never had someone, I don't think we've had someone from sort of the healthcare industry on the podcast yet. So, we're going to bring Dan Arcari on, and we'll tell you more about him in a second. But we're really excited about that. Before we do that, let's jump into a bit of news. Bhavin, why don't you kick us off?
Yeah, sure. So for news, right, I have a couple of funding rounds that I wanted to talk about. I know the startup market looks really slow, and with the Silicon Valley Bank,
that wasn't a fun weekend, that's for sure.
I know, and everybody was in panic mode. So all the people, all of our friends in the startup ecosystem, man, I don't know how you guys survived that weekend, but I'm sure I'm glad that we are at least past that first hurdle.
Some might say we're not. We haven't seen the fallout, right? But I don't know. It's I wonder what it'll do to the acquisition market, if anything, right? So maybe you'll know more than I do.
No, this is just, I think the rounds that actually get announced publicly right now have been under the works for months, right? So this is just, things that they decided to disclose even in this environment. So a couple of Kubernetes focused rounds, Cast.ai, they raised, so they are a cost management or a cost optimization startup that have started using the term AI in their description. So they are
Very
powered by
smart.
AI. Yeah, this is the
Very
market
smart.
for to raise money with anything with AI, right?
Yeah, if you're not into marketing at all,
Mhm.
it doesn't have to make sense. Just
Yeah.
put it in the name.
Yeah, so they ended up raising or closing on a $20 million investment round. This they didn't say that this was Series B, but like looking at the Crunchbase history, their seed was in I think 2020. This is when
Yep.
they've like founded the company. Series A was in 2021, and then this is Series B in 2023. I think they have raised a total of $38 million over these 3 rounds. But again, their value prop is similar to what we have done with KubeCost. Like I know we had people from KubeCost on the podcast where you can connect your Kubernetes clusters, and then organizations can see recommendations and use these automation techniques to reduce the costs, reduce the amount of money that they're spending on these different cloud platforms. So
Right.
another player in their ecosystem, and again, cost management, and now with the AI buzzword, is a really hot space in 2023, right? So congratulations to everyone at Cast AI. And then the second startup that raised some money was SpeedScale. So I know they are a Kubernetes Bytes alumni. I know we had the CTO, Matt Leray, on the pod. They raised a new funding round, bringing their total funding or total money raised to $9 million, which includes the pre-seed and seed funding. So they're still in the really early stages, trying to find product market fit and trying to solve a very specific use case for customers. So if you don't know what SpeedScale does, right? SpeedScale helps organizations test their apps using a copy of the production data. So like taking that snapshot of all the load that your application will go through in production, taking a snapshot of it and making sure you do that, do run your apps through the same data or same scale before you actually push your apps to production. So this looks like a seed funding round of 6.8 million, which brings your total funding raised to $9 million. So congratulations, Matt and their co-founders.
Congratulations, Matt. Yeah, that was, I feel like that was early days with SpeedScale, but throwing it back there.
I know. I think when we had Matt on the pod, it was like 6 months after they had graduated from Y Combinator, and we actually got into touch with them from Contain IQ. But yeah, again, new funding round is always good news, especially in this environment. So great work, guys. Yep. And then the final news article that I had was more around that edge space. I know, Ryan, you and I have found these articles over the past few episodes, but Microsoft enters this ecosystem with something called as AKS, or Azure Kubernetes Service Edge Essentials. This is now a generally available service where they provide a CNCF conformant Kubernetes and K3s distribution, which is fully supported and managed by Microsoft. So like you can like they provide you with the PowerShell scripts and commandlets to set up these remote Kubernetes clusters. These can be single or multi-node Kubernetes clusters, and their deployment is fully automated, and they can be run on any Windows PC class device. So it can be running Windows 10, Windows 11 IoT, Enterprise Pro, any of these different flavors on a Windows PC class device, and you can run these Edge Essentials Kubernetes clusters. So that's something like if you're a developer, if you have these edge devices which are not the ruggedized server hardware that you might have, if you just have some basic edge devices like a laptop running in the back of a closet, you can now run Kubernetes on top of it and manage it through the Azure portal.
Very cool. Very cool. I do like what Azure is doing with their cloud services and really staying sort of modern. I was just writing a blog post about sort of the WASM ecosystem, and I know we had a podcast about that more recently, and they have sort of a preview for running the Runwazi node pools, which was mentioned on our show, and just seeing all the things they're doing here. And actually, one of the pieces of news that I have here was a preview for pod sandboxing, which is basically it. And we did cover pod sandboxing. But I can say that terribly. Pod sandboxing. Say that 10 times fast. Is actually Kata. No, not Kata. It's
Kata.
Kata containers. Thank you. Too many terms in this in this world. So we covered that.
Just imagine security. Being a consumer or a user of all these technologies.
Exactly. We did cover those sort of concepts in the security high level episode and what kind of containers do for you and sort of isolate things and kind of use the kernel and things like that. So, just between that, I think now is a preview with their AKS service and just seeing everything they're doing here. It's really cool to see how they're staying sort of on top of it. So that was definitely one of them. I'll put the link in there for the pod sandboxing. Another one is the Data on Kubernetes community. We're huge fans. We've done some talks, participated in this community. If you're at KubeCon Amsterdam, instead of their typical Data on Kubernetes day, which you typically get as part of like the events prior to KubeCon, they're doing a meetup instead on April 18th at one of the offices in Amsterdam, sort of the district area of Amsterdam, at one of a company who basically runs Data on Kubernetes. And we'll put the link in there, but basically they'll cover everything about what DOK is. They'll have some community talks, which is a little different style of the day. There will be the day again in North America, Chicago, in the fall. So a little different, but we'll put the link to that meetup. Not a huge amount of space. I think it's in the 100, 120 people, which is actually pretty big for a meetup, all things considered. So definitely go check that out if you're into the sort of this community about databases on Kubernetes. That's an awesome community, and really happy they're going to be over there in Amsterdam.
No, the one thing that surprised me was I saw on Twitter today, like just today, March 20th, that Bart is leaving the Data on Kubernetes community. And I was like, man, the community is going to feel a lot different. Like the amount of work that Bart has put in building and managing and making sure it's a fair and equal community, man, that guy did some awesome work. So thank you, Bart, if you're listening to this. If you're not, you should be. Come on, Bart.
Maybe we'll reach out to him, get him on here and talk about his experience. It might be fun. But yeah, he's done a lot for that community, so I'm sure he'll be greatly missed. The other one we had here, if you haven't been paying attention to the Kubernetes community and ecosystem, or if you haven't gone to Kubernetes.io, if you're at all, you'll see a giant banner at top for the last few weeks. And I know we've actually mentioned this on this show quite a while ago in the episodes about the container registry, k8s.gcr.io, is being basically phased out. And there was a lot of concern about what this was going to do, what they were going to replace it with. The latest news, and this is what this update is covering, is that this KDS GCR.io will be redirected to registry.kds.io. And there's a whole bunch of information on what you need to know about image polls, what it does for that, whether you have things sort of blacklisted, whitelisted, DNS wise. Anyway, the point being is that this could cause a lot of pain, and they're doing a lot in the community to try to make it less painful. This is one of the things. The redirect is supposed to be less painful. So go read about it.
I was reading about it, right? Like the redirect is perfect, but just keep in mind, right? It is valid only from March 20th. Like today is when they'll actually switch over. I think they end the redirect on 3rd of April or something like that. So after that, the older registry is completely gone. So they are giving you kind of a grace period for you to make sure that you are moving everything that needs to be moved. So again, go to the link that Ryan will put in the show notes, and we'll make sure that or you guys make sure that you have your bases covered.
Yes, absolutely. It has the potential to be pretty hurtful if you still use some of the old registries. So don't, and go read it. So we'll put it in there and be the best advocates we can in this space. The last one I have is, we've had Brendan Burns on the show, and he's, I believe, already done a CNCF webinar. It's called Kubernetes in 2023. I actually love how broad this topic is. And they really keep it at a level which relates really well. They do it with the folks from Weaveworks, which we're also a fan of. And they kind of dive into sort of a lot of things in the ecosystem, the community, what it means to do things, GitOps wise, because they're talking with Weaveworks. So definitely go check that out. I think it's a really good video to go learn there. And I believe that is all my news and all your news for the week. Let's dive into our guest then. So our guest is Dan Arcari. He works for Zus Health. Actually, local Bostonian at one point. Well, the company is is anyway. He travels here every now and then, so it's good to have someone local on the show. But he's sort of a cloud and backend technologist, but has done all sorts of things for Zus and a lot in the healthcare ecosystem. So you'll learn more about that when he comes on the show. So without further ado, let's get Dan on the show. Dan, welcome to the show. Welcome to Kubernetes Bytes. Bob and I are happy to have you here. Give our listeners a little bit of an introduction of who you are and what you do.
Yeah, thanks. It's great to be here. I appreciate the opportunity. So I'm Dan Arcari. I'm currently manager of a small security and infrastructure team at Zus Health, a healthcare startup focused on the healthcare data interchange. We've been going about 2 years. I was, I think, employee number one, or darn close to it. I'd have to go check. Not a founder, but number one after that. Prior to that, I worked at Athena Health, a much larger player in the space. And then if you want to delve deep back in the history, at one point I worked in banking and also on slot machine firmware, which could be its own whole podcast.
I want to know if I have any ins with those slot machines now. You got to tell me which ones to go to.
Everybody asks.
He didn't say no. Just putting that out there.
So should we just drive to Everett? Like I know we have an encore there, right?
Nice.
No, okay. So I think, Dan, we really, as Ryan said, right, we're really excited to have you on the podcast to talk about like that practitioner's approach of how you manage your infrastructure and how you use containers and Kubernetes maybe. So before we dive into what it looks like today, right? As you said, you are employee number one. So like you were responsible for building this from the ground up. So can you talk about like where you started? Like what did it look like? And then we'll talk about how we got to where we are right now.
Sure. I think we had a pretty standard approach. AWS, we run entirely on AWS. I should add that. So there's no on-premise, there's no colo facilities. So it makes the footprint pretty small. There's a few other SaaS services, but primarily it's a AWS-only deployment. And for the large part, this is like most applications, a bit passing setup, right? There's no hardware, there's no IoT. So starting off, we have a multi-account approach. That's pretty typical these days. You run things through Control Tower and organizations. We could dive into that a little bit at some point. There's some interesting nuances there. And for the large part, we deploy services, or at least we did in the beginning, on ECS with one team using EKS. And I think over the past 2 years, that's still largely the case. And we'll get into sort of tuning down the EKS a little bit in that story. Teams are also moving over heavily into Lambda and step functions, where I think those have really matured as what used to be maybe interesting options a couple years ago to why wouldn't we use that now? It seems to be almost the default.
Gotcha. No, that's interesting, right? Like you basically covered ECS, which used to be AWS's version of container orchestration, to EKS, to serverless and step functions. So like you basically have a breadth of all the different types of application deployment that one can have. So like what kind of applications do you run on top? Like are these native ingrown applications built on containers following microservices principles, or what does your application stack look like?
Yeah, these are all microservices. So they're primarily homegrown, some combination of Node and Go. There's one licensed product, which is something that's provided as a container to us that we operate. That's Java based. So that's going to stay on ECS for a while. We can't Lambda-ify that or turn that into serverless. The rest are homegrown. And then there was some other, the Kubernetes things also had some scheduled jobs and some batch processes that were running. Those have been migrated for scalability reasons over to, again, the serverless stack and Lambda. Not that you couldn't have done it in Kubernetes necessarily, but the team felt more comfortable writing those in Lambda. I think people were largely more familiar with AWS native services than diving into Kubernetes and then writing on it. So I think you do find this in some environments where if people are not already familiar with Kubernetes, it's at least a perceived lift to take that on in addition to the engineering work to actually build out the service. Some of that is possibly a hangover. If you go back, I don't know, 7 years or so, 7 or 8 years, when you had to operate a Kubernetes cluster and then run stuff on it, that's a lot of work, right? Operating, and Ryan knows this well. Standing up a cluster, especially on-prem, on your own metal, is a big task. Now, of course, you wouldn't do that in most cases today. You would use a cloud offering. You would just use EKS, which takes most of that load away. But even so, I think there's a perception of learning that control plane separately that people feel comfortable in ECS. And so they stick with that, or now, moving over to serverless.
Yeah. So that's a good point, right? I mean, we've touched on several different things already, and it's in the first 5 minutes, right? You have some ECS in there, which is, you mentioned is sort of a product that's given to you. That's a really good reason to kind of keep things there. I know you mentioned there's some Kubernetes, and personally, I know we had a conversation in the past that, some Kubernetes was there, but it didn't really fit the bill. And you've mentioned serverless a few times. Could you kind of dive into why you've moved towards serverless from Kubernetes, and I know there's some things that may still exist in Kubernetes and what fits well there, right? Like kind of like talk to that.
Yeah, I'll say it's not just the Kubernetes tasks that have moved over to serverless, but other things too that might have been on ECS. That when we look at the kind of scalability we need, it's not clear that a container really offers us anything. When you're starting from ground zero and you have no code. And you don't have to worry about what might have been there before, and maybe that was packaged as a container, or maybe you had all that code bundled in one place before. When you don't have any of that, and you're starting from scratch, these days, the sophistication of Lambda and step functions and related technologies does make you ask, why don't we just do that? It's one of these, I like to have sort of background mantras when I think about running a software company or working in one. And one of them is, what are other people doing? Why are they doing it? And how's it going?
Sure.
And so whenever you approach these things these days, especially when you don't have some unique aspect to it, like we have a hardware transponder or there's a train involved somewhere, right? When it's just data, it does seem that serverless is one of the simpler things you can do because you get infinite scalability, basically. So that can displace not only just some Kubernetes workloads, but ECS and other things too, when you don't need to have it in containers. So I would say that if I thought I had to run a massively scaled container fleet at some company for whatever reason, I would probably stick with Kubernetes. I like the control plane. I like the separation of infrastructure from application operation that it affords. And I would make a deliberate effort to ensure that people at the company are trained up on it if they're not. But when you don't have that, challenge or operational requirement, in a lot of cases these days, it does seem like Lambda is, for a lot of cases, an easy way to go. So it's not really a Kubernetes issue. It's just, why don't we just do that, right?
Okay. So it sounds like, Dan, your team uses a combination of all. But then at some point, you guys evaluated ECS versus EKS. Were there any specific findings that made you lean more towards one or the other? Like, I know you said knowledge gap was definitely one point. Like, people were more comfortable with ECS and EKS. Are there any other ones that you want to highlight?
Yeah, I think you'll find that I have no data to support this, so I could be wrong, and we should look. But I would think, on average, people are more familiar with ECS or comfortable with than EKS, unless they've operated with Kubernetes before. ECS is AWS's own service. I think there might be a presumption that that's what you should run because it's what they wrote, and it has some pluses and gotcha areas too, or pitfalls. It's not perfect. But it's there by default. It's supported by CloudFormation. It's supported by Terraform, and it just works. So people think, okay, we'll just use that. When you talk about some of the organizational decisions, so this is something that happens even at a 50-person startup all the way to a 6,000-person company. Yep. These questions of who's deciding what we're doing, right? Are we all going to deploy services in the same way? Are we going to invest in our own? These things always get code names, like it's Hydra or it's Tentacle. Everyone's going to deploy using this thing that we develop. It always has a name associated with it. But then you're investing time in that technology that then blocks people behind it. So you have to be careful about, are you all actually trying to deploy things the same way? And so sometimes you just don't make a decision, which is what I think we let our teams do in the first place, where we said, okay, your team is going to be responsible for operating your service. This is sort of the AWS model that they practice, obviously at much larger scale, but you get paged at 2 a.m, you answer the support calls, you write the service, you do the bugs, you do the whole thing. And we let our teams do that in the beginning. You want to run on ECS? Okay. We're not here to tell you we're here to run, my team is here to deploy networking infrastructure,
Yep.
to run our SOC2 audit critically is a major function of the team, but we're not necessarily here to tell you how to run every aspect of your deployment. And left alone, most people gravitated toward ECS, and then a couple used EKS, and then now there's serverless on top of it.
Okay, that's an interesting thought, I guess. Yeah. So, like for the compliance checks, again, you said SOC2. Obviously, you guys are in healthcare, so HIPAA might be a framework that you have to comply with. It looks like using a native service like ECS does have some benefits over an open source based managed service that maybe Amazon offers, and maybe it's easier to use or run through all those compliance checks.
I think you could satisfy, and HIPAA is, if you actually read it, it's actually tougher in some ways to comply with than SOC 2, which is more prescriptive. HIPAA has a lot of general prescriptions about how to operate your company. SOC 2 is much more specific. I think you could be compliant with either. It's, especially in SOC, you're primarily focused. There's a few critical things around data encryption and privacy, but in a lot of cases, what you're really focused on is operating in a manner that matches your policies.
Okay.
So there can't be sort of arbitrary processes. If you say we're doing this is how we review our access to critical systems quarterly. Okay, you have to have that in the policy, and you have to follow it, and you have to show that you did that. And then you have 100 or so controls like that. So I think you could do it with either service, really. I wouldn't be too worried about either ECS or EKS or anything else being deficient for an audit.
Okay. No, thank you for clarifying that, because I for some reason I was under that impression. So talking about serverless, right?
Yeah, there was. I guess I could maybe add, there was one particularly difficult thing to resolve with AWS. This took until just last year to resolve. It was whether EKS on Fargate was on their HIPAA eligible. When you go to the AWS HIPAA eligible list, which is now most of it, hundreds of services, used to be about 10. EKS Fargate was specifically excluded, whereas ECS Fargate was explicitly listed, and they never really had a good answer until we kind of worked through with their legal team, and eventually they whatever they had to prove out was validated, and now you can do that. That was a little bit of a reservation for a while, but that's
interesting.
Legally cleared up now.
Was that also, I know you had mentioned that, there's been a lot of changes in HIPAA and AWS recently as well. That being one of them, but also something about dedicated instances. So are you finding that, AWS and cloud in general is really kind of, moving sort of with healthcare now, and kind of unblocking a lot of sort of things that you can use to accelerate what you want to be doing, at Zus? And
It was definitely the case. This was 2017 or 2018. I'd have to check, where you had to use dedicated instances if you were running HIPAA or healthcare stacks, PHI stacks in AWS. That was a requirement. I'd have to go check. It's 2017 or 2018. So 4 or 5 years ago. When that was removed as a restriction, that opened up things like API Gateway and hundreds. It really opened up their full suite of services because that's all run on their ephemeral hardware behind the scenes. When they didn't have that dedicated requirement, you could really open it up. So now you see a lot of, I'm not sure what the overall migration is. You might have seen more lift and shift before. Now you have, why don't you just build it on AWS to start with? You don't need a co-location center. You don't need to run this on your own stacks. Just develop it in AWS. But it would be interesting to see data on on that sort of native development.
Yeah,
gotcha.
Absolutely.
And go ahead, Ryan.
No, I was going to switch gears to serverless. So if you want to add something to that, go for it. Okay.
No, one last point, right before we move to serverless. I think it was interesting. Like requiring dedicated instances doesn't really help with the whole value prop of cloud, that it's elastic, or it helps you save on costs because you're not doing a lot of things on your own or managing hardware. Dedicated infrastructure. I'm glad that AWS moved away from that and you guys were able to use shared infrastructure.
Yeah, it would save on capacity planning for sure, which at a large scale is, having worked at a place where there was both a large cloud footprint and on-prem, that was still a significant area of investment, right? Having to figure out how to account for that future traffic growth. So it would have saved you that, but then you're having to purchase, reserve capacity and savings plans and all these things that go along with, well, why don't we just not have it run when we don't need it to? If it's a Lambda, just, or even a scalable node group, right? Just if there's nothing happening at 2 a.m, just, okay, we don't need to.
Yeah.
What's more secure than something not running?
That's a valid point, and a good segue, I feel like, to serverless as well, because sort of the epitome of shared compute, that being services, maybe that's a good place to start. Like, what are the benefits of serverless for you? And I know you had mentioned, that's the, if you can run it there, that's sort of the go-to these days for you. So yeah, let's start with the benefits.
I think one is just conceptual. Often, in software, we think of it as a technical field, but if you really stop and think, ultimately, up in the top 5 most important things are communication and clarity. And like technical concerns are somewhere between 9th and 17th, probably. So when you think about code, you're really thinking about, well, who's going to have to read this later, right?
Yeah.
And something like using lambdas or these tightly packaged groups of compute or compute modules, it lets you express what you're trying to do. What are we actually doing here, right? In a way where you don't get bound up into, we have to build an image, and then we have to have security for the Docker base layer, and we have to test the whole image and ship it and push it around, and we're going to run an API service on top of the thing in the container. Like, those are all fine ways to develop an application, but you don't have to think about that. What's the code? What are you actually doing? And so just because again, the people part of software development is so important and often the hardest part to get right. When you don't have to think about that stuff, just where's the Lambda that does X? Yeah. Oh, here it is. And it's 50 lines of code. And that's all there is, other than maybe some Terraform to deploy the whole thing, right? And all that. So I would say first and foremost is just that conceptual simplicity. Let you think about and reason about what you're doing. Oftentimes in a way that's easier than a container. Maybe not all the time. Yeah. The second, of course, is just infinite scalability, right? When you don't even have to worry about auto-scaling groups and scaling policies and all those things. When you just say, hey, this will run when it needs to. And it won't otherwise. That's a pretty nice model, and it works. There are some, and you can go look for these curves of where cost-wise, depending on the amount of memory and time you're invoking, right? There are some, it's not that all use cases necessarily work in Lambda. But as long as you're under that curve, that's a very nice approach to say you have as much scalability as you need without really having to do a whole lot. That's a nice win.
Yeah, but I think when we did our intro to serverless or serverless 101 episode last week or last couple of weeks, one of the things that keeps coming up is the cold start problem, right? Like, how do you handle that inside your organization?
Cold start for development practices, or
no, for the Lambda functions to actually be deployed, like whenever they are invoked, like it takes some seconds to maybe a minute. I don't know what the time frame is for the actual application to be online. Is that okay in the use case that you have, or how do you handle that?
That's not something that I've run into too much, dealing with it directly. So one of the aspects of being running audits means I don't get that right hands-on code too much anymore. So I would defer that to our dev teams and ask them what we're having to do to account for that. So I have not heard of any major hurdles there, but it's it could also be that I'm provisioning SOC evidence and maybe I haven't run into it myself.
Okay, no, that works for me.
Yeah, I know when we were kind of digging into it, we sort of found people were on both sides of that fence, where it was like, that's something you just accept, and it doesn't even happen all the time, right? It just happens when something isn't prepped and ready to go for some time. It's not used for a while, and it might be an issue versus not. So I feel like there's sort of a split of folks in the community out there, and those using serverless and are happy with it, I find are just like, it happens sometimes, but it's something you accept, right? So, I do want to dig in. You mentioned the term step function, and we didn't actually cover that a lot last week, and I'd love to kind of dig into sort of conceptually where Lambda and step function and function as a service kind of all kind of mixed together. What's the difference? What's used for what?
Yeah, step functions is just a way to compose an application made of many lambdas into a state machine, basically. So without getting into taking the whole thing apart, there's basically JSON or maybe YAML2 file that controls. Okay, here's the lambdas that do things as part of the state machine, and here's the data that can be passed between them. And here's the reasons why the state would change, and you pay AWS every time the state changes, and you pay AWS every time the Lambda gets invoked. And so you can compose state machine-like applications together, as one machine, basically, versus just going and deploying a whole bunch of Lambdas and then knowing, right? One thing to look out for in programming, right? Surprise dependencies, or the code just happens to know that you have to call this thing without it being injected or discovered somehow. Just it lets you get around that problem a little bit by saying, well, these are composed as part of a holistic application, but they're just separate functions. Versus deploying, say, 50 separate Lambdas that happen to know how to talk to each other, then you have to keep a Confluence document somewhere that has all the lines, boxes and lines on it, right? Which then nobody looks at it after it was first made, right?
That makes sense. And I know I feel like we might have not mentioned it on this show yet, but I know some things were being rewritten for Lambda. And I know in many cases you said some teams just, they choose ECS, they choose Kubernetes or EKS, or they choose Lambda. But in some cases, it sounds like you're either making things kind of work with Lambda or choosing them. What is sort of rewriting something for Lambda that necessarily wasn't there look like if maybe it's on EKS and your team wants to move it, or a team wants to move it to Lambda?
Yeah, so previously there was some batch processing done where data was being sourced from external partners, and you had to sort of poll periodically and figure out, is there data there, right? And when there is, you pick it up and then process it, do what you have to do, and then move it along through the system. In this case, that can be streamlined by not having to worry about the size of data to be discovered from the other endpoint. Just knowing that when it's picked up, so you still have a polling mechanism because we don't control the other end of it. But for however much data you get back from the partner, you can kick off one of these step-based pipelines and just say, here, do what you need to do, and it will end up in the right place. And we don't need to worry about how big is some cluster or how much compute has to be allocated. As long as each of those little steps is done in a way where you don't take 50 gigs of memory and an enormous cost to do it, you break it down into bite-sized chunks.
Sure.
It lets you just say, okay, we're just going to offload that, and however many of them need to run are running, and we don't have to worry about things like actually executing batch jobs ourselves to process the data. It will just run when it needs to, right?
I think that's an interesting approach. Like we have spoken a lot about all the different technologies, right? But I wanted to talk about like talent and how when you hire them, is choosing something like serverless the right decision when it comes to like onboarding new people? Like, do you feel that in the industry right now, we have a lot of developers that already know how to work with these modern technologies, or what does the ramp up time look like for people that are new to the team that have to work on these technologies?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. This is casually from a fairly small set of data points. I would say that because they're AWS primitives, there's less ramp up for Lambda than there actually is for many container services. And I would include ECS in that. ECS has a fair amount of nuance associated with it to get it right. If you want to do anything more than just, here's a container file, just go run it and we'll forget about it. If you really care about blue-green and scaling, there's a lot of, and hot updating things where you don't have downtime. That's not necessarily dead simple in ECS either. So I would say that serverless, or at least Lambda, it's a big field, but that's at least to say Lambda probably has a lower ramp up cost than operating containers, I think, more generally. Kubernetes, I think you tend to find people that have used it heavily in production before and they're experts on it and quite competent, or people that have heard about it and are interested but don't have a lot of deep experience with it. And then you have to consider, whenever you bring a tool into a company, it's how do we get everybody on board? We don't want to have this be where there's 3 people that know about it and you have to always go ask them. If you can, let's level up everybody. We did that with Terraform, I think, in the beginning. Terraform sometimes can be something where people like it, but they're just there's some questions about, well, how do we actually do this? How does it compare to CloudFormation? You always want to try and level up, get everybody rowing in the same direction. So, but there's some nuance to serverless, but I think overall, especially once you have a template to say, here's a way to deploy, it bundles it into a zip file and you can go push it out there. There's a learning curve, but I think it's actually fairly shallow.
Okay. That's not bad.
Be interesting to measure though.
Yeah, I know. Like, again, the reason for my question is like we did an episode around platform engineering, and that was one of the tasks, right? Because recently, the reason larger organizations are building these internal development platforms is because they don't expect the developers to know every technology. So they give them options that's available. So I just wanted to know how it is when we're talking about all the different kinds of services, but still in that AWS ecosystem.
Yeah, that's always a critical question. So, something in economics, which is sort of a hobby of mine, is the degree of specialization is based on the size of the market, right? So if you have a mom and pop restaurant, grandma's in the back cooking everything, right? Just making the sauce, baking the cookies, right? The whole thing. When you have a restaurant that's serving a couple hundred people a day or more, and you have 20 people working in the kitchen, there's one guy doing sauce. That's it. He makes the sauce. And you can see this in dev teams too. If you have a 4-person dev team at a startup, you can't go hire a DevOps person to just say, okay, you're going to go do all the build stuff and make sure and check on security. And, everybody kind of has to pitch in because you can't afford to have a quarter of your budget in one particular skill.
Yeah.
If you have this sort of prototypical 2-pizza team and you're 8 to 12 people on a service, then you could, and your revenue is sufficient to support that. Sure. You could have on each team, you can say, look, security is a cross-cutting concern. There is a centralized InfoSec team, but there's also going to be somebody who's maybe half their job on your team is to look out for security, and someone else whose specialty is build systems and CI and deployments and so on. So it depends. It really depends on the size of your organization.
Yeah, I really like that analogy, and I know it's one that we've briefly touched on before. And along those lines, we did. I think we talked about in the past, which I'd love to double click on here, is just because I've heard you say just because you have the money doesn't mean you should, and that's somewhat related to the size and the market and to the specialization. But is there a lesson learned there that you've been through that maybe you can apply here to that?
Yeah, you want to look at, I guess on some level, it's just basic financial accountability. But I've seen cases where there's a massive spend on cloud at the beginning of a project, including third-party licenses and all sorts of tooling. And you will need some of it. But you want to be careful about, have you spent $1 million before any one penny has been earned? And my sort of somewhat known for wacky analogies, but it's sort of like deciding you're going to get into rock climbing and you go buy $2,000 of the best shoes and fancy ropes and a belayer, and before you even set foot on the cliff face, you should start with someone's leftover equipment and see if it's going to work. And the cloud can be that way too. You can spend $50,000 on code scanning tools, and you can spend $20,000 or more on your audit tools, and you can spend another $30,000 on a container security. You can keep spending 20 to 50,000. GitHub will want you to buy their advanced security. Everybody has a plus version of whatever they're doing. Before you know it, you're spending $300,000 a year on license upgrades, and you have to at some point stop and think, what can we get away with that's still secure, that meets our requirements, and then see if you really need it. You always want to let find the pole that touches the bottom of the lake, right? Like, where are we? Do we need to spend $1 million right away? And with AWS, you can actually. I remember at Athena Health, I felt fairly early on in the approach to saying we're going to have a lot of accounts, possibly hundreds, if I recall correctly, each segmented into a specific purpose. And it felt like the tools actually evolved to support that. So I don't think we were the only ones deciding that. Things like Transit Gateway showed up, and Control Tower, and organizations, and all these things that govern that federated account footprint. But then if you actually look under the covers, there's a cost to that, because Control Tower will turn on config for you by default. And just start tracking and config. If you don't pay attention to it, it tracks every resource change. So if you have your dev accounts and your test accounts and then your production accounts, every single time you deploy a container, you're paying a small, couple halves of a penny for that. So you actually do want to be careful about even the assumed best architecture defaults in AWS, like config and Control Tower. They're great, but there's a cost to them, and you should be aware of that when you get started. And maybe you don't need 30 accounts right away. Maybe 2 is fine. So something to be aware of when you get started with AWS until revenue, is enough to clearly justify all those licenses and expenses.
Yes, it's an interesting problem, because I feel like that there's on one hand, we often dive into these new architectures, and I feel like we saw a lot of that spend happening when people were diving into cloud, but on top of that it was Kubernetes and containers, and I often wonder, right, is it the shiny new toy, and having enough money, or is it we often work in this industry by solving pain points, and if you've been on the side of the pain point, you often want to not have that pain, right? But there's also some real benefit in, to your point about using used gear, is experiencing a little bit of pain to use a tool to solve a problem versus to get a tool in case you have a problem, right? Which is not really money at all. It's more of a mindset. And I think maybe goes back directly to your kind of communication and organizational conversation as well.
Yeah, I think we all know if you had $1 for every time somebody said we're going to put an abstraction wrapper around the database in case we want to change out the database, you never will. You won't. And if you do, it's because your database requirements have probably changed sufficiently that you're going to redesign the whole application anyway. You're going to move the thing from a relational, setup to, you're not just going to switch from, Oracle to Postgres, and it's going to be that simple. You will have done so as part of a broader change to move from relational to, say, something like Dynamo, right? So it's back to that, we all know about the premature optimization being the root of all evil. I think that does largely hold true in computing. There's not always great first principles to stand on all the time, but if you can just wait and know that you need something, I do think you're most of the time in a better off place than sort of pre-deciding that you have to have all these things, and then you're in a weird unknown world of, then you have to go continually check those to justify that, or else they just stay there forever.
Yeah, absolutely. Cool. Well, I mean, I think, time flies. We're about a half an hour in, and I want to make sure we have time for our fun news segment. And then we do want to, before we dive into that, if there's anywhere people can, either get a hold of you, or if you have anything, to share on GitHub or a website, or, someone wants to just ask you a question, is there any place that you prefer people get, in touch with you or anything like that?
Sure. You can find me on LinkedIn, easily searchable. I also maintain a blog called Bytewise, Bytewise, which has very occasional comments. I do try to tie in those economic concepts into software engineering practices. So folks can check out Bytewise. Otherwise, just find me on LinkedIn.
And is Zus Health hiring? Yeah.
Zus Health currently, I don't believe there's any positions at the moment. We did just have a second successful financing round. And I think if you want to reach out to us, we're on LinkedIn, or just find us at healthcare conferences. And I think if you find us, again, on LinkedIn, our product people will let you know where to find us at healthcare conferences, because they're always in attendance.
Yep.
Absolutely. All right. On to the fun segment, Dan. I know we had prepped you a little bit that we were going to ask you a question. And here's the question, and then we can hand it over to you if you want to answer it, or let ChatGPT answer it for you. And the question is, if you had to explain cloud computing in healthcare to a 5-year-old, how would you do it? And what kind of metaphor or analogy would you use?
Well, having 3 kids, I'm pretty sure I have explained this before, but I'm actually curious on ChatGPT's answer. So can we see what it replies?
Absolutely. And I
provide mine too after that too.
Yeah, absolutely. You can compare it. All right. So this is how ChatGPT would explain cloud computing in healthcare to a 5-year-old. It starts like this. Have you ever played a game on your tablet or phone that saves your progress so you can pick up where you left off later? Well, imagine if doctors and nurses could do the same thing with their patients' health information. They could save it in a special place called the cloud, in quotes, as I'm putting it there, if you can't see my hands, which is like a giant invisible backpack that can hold lots of important things. That way, if a doctor in a different place needs to see the information, they can just go look up in the cloud instead of having to ask the patient or family to bring it in. It's like magic, and it helps doctors take better care of their patients. That's how ChatGPT would go about it with a 5-year-old. I dig the backpack part. I feel like was hitting on something there.
I think there's a sales effort in there too. To be clear, it's not just an explanation. But
yeah. Clearly pulling from many different sources there. I mean, the backpack
I can't remember whatever cloud service GPT runs on. I can't remember the sponsor.
Azure.
On Azure, yeah.
There you go. I like that. Yeah, so that's pretty fun. I don't know if you had thought about it at all, but we always like to ask those kind of questions.
My simplistic answer for the cloud is always, it's just imagine all the computers it takes to to run the software. In this case, imagine all the nurses and doctors are doing all day. Someone put those computers in someone else's building so they don't have to worry about it.
There you go.
Nice. It's somebody else's computer. Yeah.
Yeah.
Nice.
Awesome. Well, this has been super fun, Dan. I think, we touched on a lot of different topics, but I personally learned a lot. I think, our listeners will as well, and they may have follow-up questions for you, and that's all good. So again, I just want to thank you for coming on the show and being a part of Kubernetes Bytes.
Thank you both. I really appreciated it.
Thanks, Dan.
Nice. That was fun, Bhavin. I know we mentioned it earlier that we haven't had anyone really in the healthcare space. So it's really fun to have someone who not only has that serverless experience, but, has kind of really had experience in Kubernetes and why they do use it, don't use it, still use serverless. I thought it was a really interesting point of view, and also a lot of the pieces about the non-technological pieces of the puzzle there. So yeah, let me hear your takeaways about that conversation.
No, I think you started on the right in the right direction, right? Like importance of finding the right tool for the job. Like not everything had to be Kubernetes, or like they started with some applications. Some of the commercial applications that they are buying from off the shelf can only be run on ECS. So they're not messing with it, not trying to move it to serverless. They have some teams inside the organization that are using Kubernetes and EKS. But then, as Dan said, right, some of them, like they have a go to serverless as the default option if you can policy. So like they're trying to guide people, but not forcing them to choose the on one path or the other. So I think that helps. Like everybody has a different skill set, different comfort levels. So if you're ready to take on the additional responsibilities or costs that comes on from using something like ECS or EKS, go and feel free to do that. But if you want something that's more supported by the organization, serverless is the solution. So I think that helps. Like again, it didn't come as a surprise that organizations do this, but it just helps us reinforce the point that, okay, you always need to make sure that you're not adopting technologies because they are really cool and that's the next big thing, but you're adopting technologies because it helps solve a specific problem for you.
Yeah, and to the point of feeling the pain first is not always a terrible thing.
Yeah.
Although if you listen to the sales folks, they definitely will tell you otherwise. As I think Dan made very clear in his example, for me, I like the conversations around sort of the economies of scale related to like adopting new technology, especially the metaphor around one guy making sauce really well versus sort of a cook doing everything in the kitchen, so to speak. Probably not paraphrasing, of course, to what Dan said. Yeah. But it's a good lesson and sort of, thing to pick up on. And on top of that, sort of the organization as a whole and the communication, which came up a lot in the platform engineering podcast as well, being sort of 1 and 2 in the priority list, right? Versus technology, as Dan put it, I think somewhere between 9th and 13th or something like that. Just to kind of push on the point of, if you get those other things incorrect or you really struggle with them, tech's not going to fix it. So I did also like, to your point, using the right tool for the right job, ECS being sort of delivered, or he mentioned a product being delivered that way. And that's a perfect reason for it to stay that way. I know we've talked in the past, there's some cases where you don't want to migrate, you don't want to move things off of or choose new tooling. And the fact that you don't own it and don't run it is a perfectly good reason. So that's a really interesting one to me. And just the adoption of serverless and what it can do for sort of the scalability, I think is a really interesting concept of definitely the case here being such a new company, being able to start with a fresh set of architectural eyes, so to speak, and kind of choosing that path mixed with some of the others, as you mentioned.
Awesome. That's it.
Yeah. Good. Well, I hope everyone enjoyed that one. I think it was really enjoyable for me as well. As Bhavin mentioned, mystery for next week's episode. Bhavin will be taking some well-deserved time off. So, enjoy that. That's fine. So it'll be me and someone next week. And
this is a surprise even for me, guys. Like Ryan hasn't told me what he has planned. So like even on my video, I will make sure that I tune in and like check out the next episode. No pressure, Ryan.
There you go. Cool. Well, as always, if you can review the podcast, let us know what you like, don't like, send us encouraging messages. If you don't, we won't listen to the other one. I'm just kidding. All are welcome. And please go have a listen, and please feel free to suggest anything else. And with that, it brings us to the end of today's episode. I'm Ryan.
I'm Bhavin.
Thanks for joining another episode of Kubernetes Bytes. Thank you for listening to the Kubernetes Bytes podcast.